this as like the tip of an iceberg. When you see the iceberg above the surface of the water, you think constipation, gas, bloating, but then under the surface, there's all these other issues that we might not think of when we think of gut health.
Food poisoning can lead to small intestine bacterial overgrowth, or SIBO. And if it isn't treated right away and dealt with, it can lead to ongoing autoimmune SIBO, or it's called post-infectious IBS. And when you have SIBO, that means pretty much every time you eat, you bloat, unless you watch your diet really closely.
Welcome back to another episode of Wellness for Life, a LifeSeasons podcast where we aim to provide education, meaningful conversation, and inspiration to reclaim your life and your health and give you the tools to live life to its fullest. Today, we have a very special guest. Lindsey Parsons is a certified health coach working out of Tucson, Arizona. She specializes in helping clients heal gut health issues and reverse autoimmune diseases naturally. She also hosts the podcast, The Perfect Stool. Love that name. Understanding and Healing the Gut Microbiome. Prior to starting her health coaching career, she co-founded and ran a nonprofit advocating for healthier food in the Montgomery County Public Schools in Maryland. Thank you so much for being here, Lindsey.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's my pleasure.
Absolutely. Well, like I've said in past episodes, I think a lot of us who get into this field of wellness nutrition usually are coming in because we've experienced adversity of some sort. And so I'd love to share with listeners your story. What led you to pursuing a career in health coaching? What ignited this passion? Because if you listen to any of Lindsey's episodes, you know she is a wealth of knowledge. She knows her stuff. She provides such a great amount of information to be able to apply, figure out what's going on and getting the root cause. And so I'd love to just share with listeners what led up to this point.
So I had my own struggles with both autoimmunity and gut health issues. So I'll kind of go through that relatively briefly. It probably all started when I lived in Costa Rica. A few years out of college, I went there to teach English, and I had a couple incidents of food poisoning. I'm not sure which one was the more important one, but food poisoning can lead to small intestine bacterial overgrowth, or SIBO. And if it isn't treated right away and dealt with, it can lead to ongoing autoimmune SIBO, or it's called post-infectious IBS. And when you have SIBO, that means pretty much every time you eat, you bloat, unless you watch your diet really closely. And I just had bloating, and then, it developed into sort of loose stool, and it wasn't like I had diarrhea 6 times a day. I was never that bad. So I never quite thought, okay, this is something I really need to address. I did eventually see a doctor and ask about what was going on. And I had GERD as well. I had gastroesophageal reflux disease. And then it was not until actually I was diagnosed with 2 autoimmune diseases. Well, actually 3 at the beginning, because I was diagnosed with pernicious anemia, which is an autoimmune situation where you can't digest vitamin B12, and my levels were so low that they had to give me an immediate shot. I was already having tingling in my hands. Then Hashimoto's thyroiditis, and at the time, something called ITP, which they've since told me I never had. So we'll just not talk about that one. So that really sounded the alarm bells for me, because when I went to see an endocrinologist about the Hashimoto's, although my TSH levels were still okay and I didn't need to go on thyroid hormone, I said, well, what's the sort of long-term prospects with this? And she said, well, the Hashimoto's will destroy your thyroid over time until either, you'll need to go on thyroid hormone, then eventually you may need to have your thyroid removed. And I'm just going to sit and wait for that to happen. That's crazy town. Like, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to turn this thing around. So that's when I started getting serious about the combo of my gut health and autoimmune disease, and started experimenting. I did a fecal transplant on myself. That was after a couple of years.
The gut health Netflix video, I don't know if you've seen it, just came out, and they really documented what that looks like DIY. Have you seen that video?
I haven't, no.
Oh, it's phenomenal. And I've heard about the fecal transplant, and we can even get into that, but they show you vividly this couple who DIYs it. And so I don't know, what that looks like, but I mean, I'm curious, how did that work out for you?
So it was interesting because I had a doctor who was sort of open-minded, my hematologist, and he he allowed me to do sort of pre and post testing to see what would happen. So it didn't do anything with my Hashimoto's, but it did do something with my B12 levels, although it didn't change the fact that I still need to supplement with B12 sublingually. But what happened was right after I did it, all of a sudden my B12 levels just shot up in a way they hadn't from previous supplementation or shots or anything. And then slowly over time, they came back down. And our experiment was, okay, after they're high, if I take B12 not sublingually, so it's not absorbing directly into the bloodstream, but where it has to be digested through the stomach, will I still absorb it? And my levels went back down. So that was sort of our experiment to see if it made any kind of permanent changes, and it didn't. So that was really the only major change. Oh, the stool quality changed a bit for a time. But the problem with SIBO is it's happening up in the small intestine. So it's really not about what's happening in the colon. And that's really where at least a fecal transplant that goes in rectally is going to make changes. If you swallow capsules, it's possible you could make changes in the small intestine that way, but that's not the way I did it. So anyway, long and short of it was I started, looking into elimination diets and then into protocols to try and reverse the Hashimoto's. And, it took several, I went off gluten. I went off dairy. My reflux went away almost completely. Went off gluten for, several years, soy for some amount of time. And eventually I got the antibodies down to nothing. And so the Hashimoto's never proceeded. I've never had to go on thyroid hormone. My thyroid is fully functioning and intact.
Oh, that's incredible, Lindsey.
Yeah. And then the SIBO, I eventually saw a functional medicine doctor. I got treated for SIBO. Didn't quite work, got treated again. So then I learned about, as I became more interested in gut health, I became more and more aware of how to treat myself. And so then I just kind of keep it and control myself and watch it myself. And now, I'm about to do another round of testing and possibly treatment for it, because it's one of these things that when you have the autoimmune kind, it just keeps coming back. And unlike the Hashimoto's, there's not good information out there yet on how to reverse this particular problem, but I know there's research going on, so I'm hopeful that one day.
Absolutely. Well, you're taking things into your own hands. And I'm curious, were you interested in alternative health and medicine prior to getting diagnosed with all these?
I was always interested in nutrition, in good nutrition. And I can't say I was that interested in alternative health in the sense that I was following a lot of alternative health people. But mind you, this was 2014. I mean, we had the internet and everything, but there was not all the social media and all the everything that there is now, where it's so easy to find. You could stumble upon it without ever even trying. Back then, it wasn't quite so obvious. I did find a book. I went to the bookstore, I think, and I found a book by Isabella Wentz, Hashimoto's Protocol, and that was what I followed to reverse the Hashimoto's. And yeah, so I mean, at the time I wasn't, but I became more.
And especially with gut health, I think, obviously this information's been around for a while, but really it's been these last few years that it's starting to become up and coming, and we're starting hearing terminology. I think SIBO, I didn't know about that maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago. And now everybody's getting diagnosed. And, whether now conventional doctors are now starting to understand it, where, I was curious if you're a conventional doctor, I'm guessing it was a conventional doctor that started with these early diagnoses, or were you in functional medicine?
I saw a functional medicine doctor who diagnosed me with SIBO, but it is part of the standard of care now. The World, Gastroenterology Association has protocols and all that. So now most gastroenterologists should, in theory, know how to test for it and treat it, but I can't say that actually happens.
I know. I'm with you. It's an uphill battle, and I just hope functional medicine, I think, is such a beautiful thing. And, I think practitioners are making some big changes in individuals' lives. But all right, so here you are. We kind of have the backstory that led you to this health coaching. When you get clients that are coming in, what does this look like? How do you start working with clients when they're coming to you with some of these issues?
So typically I start by giving a free breakthrough session to everybody. So they have half an hour to talk to me and see if it's a good fit. And people come from all different range of situations. Some of them have seen 5 functional medicine people before me and still haven't solved their issues. Some are completely naive to the entire functional medicine world and just sort of found the podcast or found me on YouTube. And it's a whole range. So typically, if somebody's fresh to the whole thing, I will usually have a first appointment. We'll go through real thorough medical history, and I'll listen to the symptoms they're telling me about, and then we'll decide on what tests are the most appropriate. And I do stool tests. My favorite now is this US Biotech GI Advanced Profile. I used to do a lot of the GI map before that. And then typically we'll do some type of organic acids test. That's sort of the minimum if they think there's any candida issues or fungal overgrowth. And then I might do something more advanced if there's also other chronic health issues like fatigue or migraines or weight loss resistance or mental health issues, exposure to toxins that they know about, that kind of thing. So then I might do something like a metabolomics or a NutriVal. And then sometimes I also test adrenals if there's some obvious signs there that there's fatigue or reliance on caffeine or sleep-wake cycle that's disrupted.
And are most of these clients virtual clients? And so you're sending the test to them and they're doing it that way? Or what does that look like?
Right. I have an account on Rupa Health, and Rupa Health allows health coaches to go through their physician services and sort of prescribe the tests in a sense for people. So they get an email and then they order them from there. There's only a few states where you can't do that, but there's always workarounds.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's important. I think the accessibility that it can come to your house is monumental. But like you just listed all of these out. I mean, I have a wealth of a gut history, but I don't even know all these testings. So, sometimes you might, if you're listening, you're trying to do all this on your own, you might not know where to start. And so that's why working with a practitioner can be helpful. You hear the symptoms and then figure out, what are some of the testings that's going to be, the most beneficial to determine what's going on. So for instance, that acids test, what is that? I mean, obviously it's testing different acids, but I'd love to hear more about that one.
So the organic acids test is done by a number of different companies. There's the Mosaic one, there's the Organics, which is the Genova one, and now there's a Diagnostics Solutions one. And it is a series of organic acids that are metabolites of the bacterial fermentation in the gut, the fungal fermentation in the gut, and just bodily processes. And so those metabolites clue you into all sorts of things: nutrient levels, overgrowth of bacteria and yeast, detoxification markers, levels of neurotransmitters, oxalates. So there's a whole slew of things that you learn. Oh, and then of course your metabolism of amino acids, fatty acids, and carbohydrates. So you can see if there's dysfunction in the basic functions of the body that you need to be healthy and vibrant and have energy, basically.
Now, would you say that because you listed a variety of tests, would you say that there's a one test that if somebody could only get this would be it? Or is it so unique to the individual that they're all going to really test completely different things? Or is there something that, okay, this is the top priority test?
I would say if you have disrupted stool in some way or bloating, then probably you want to go with a stool test of some sort. And my favorite is the US Biotech GI Advanced Profile because it has everything the GI Map has and everything the GIFX has, and it's sort of in between the price. So for me, it's like the perfect test right now. And then if you're not having any kind of disruptions to your stool, but you have like overall body concerns or chronic issues, then I would say you want something more like a metabolomics or a NutriVal. And the main difference there is the NutriVal has more in the basic test, but you have to get a blood draw. The metabolomics is all urine, and then you can add on fatty acids and urine elements that has a bunch of minerals and then toxins. And then those add-on tests maybe bring it about to the price of the NutriVal. Well, the NutriVal has a few different markers, like it has the fat-soluble vitamins that you won't get if you're not getting a blood draw. And then so there's a blood spot you can add on for the fatty acids for the metabolomics. So roughly you can get the same stuff without having to leave your house.
Yeah, fantastic. I love that is such an accessible thing, but you really did a good job. I appreciate you clarifying the two different categories. And I think that's kind of a perfect segue into talking about typical gut issues. And I kind of think about this as like the tip of an iceberg. When you see the iceberg, above the surface of the water, you think constipation, gas, bloating, but then under the surface, there's all these other issues that we might not think of when we think of gut health. What are some of these common symptoms, whether it's the tip or whether it's below, that you're noticing through clients that are struggling with gut health?
So bloating is a very typical one. That's, if I don't see that, it's rare that we're dealing with SIBO. I also see pain in the gut or, hunger pangs when you're not, when you have an empty stomach, reflux, of course, like a burning pain in the stomach. Then, of course, there's just all the disruptions to stool, from constipation to diarrhea to loose stool, messy stool. If I forgot anything, of course, there's people who have actual diagnoses like diverticulitis or inflammatory bowel disease as well, which is Crohn's and colitis.
You have to think, I think like a lot of chronic illnesses too, and, different autoimmune, this didn't seem as frequent years ago. Like everybody, I wonder if everybody was bloating to this extent, 50 years ago. So I'm curious. I know it's individual, diet, lifestyle, all these different things, but what have you found as a really strong influence as why so many people are struggling with gut health nowadays?
I kind of suspect that it's related to, number one, overuse of antibiotics. But gosh, that was probably happening 15 or 20 years ago too. So I'm not sure. I also think more awareness brings people more to the surface to do something about it. Whereas other time before, maybe people just sort of sucked it up. I also think the greater availability of broad spectrum antibiotics. So whereas maybe when I was growing up, we were using penicillin. Now it's Cipro, right? So it's a whole level more of heavy duty antibiotics essentially that hit a whole slew of bacteria. And then I think perhaps our stressful lifestyle and then diet. No doubt the fact that the diet's gone from a more natural foods, whole foods diet to, this ultra processed foods diet and, blood sugar dysregulation that's absolutely rampant in the country, which can also just set you off, and whole slew of things.
Yeah, I think there's so many different, it feels like we're almost bombarded by all these different factors. And to your point, antibiotics, that's a whole other conversation I think I've read one dose of antibiotics can affect or influence your gut microbiome for, I think it was like up to 2 years. I don't know if you have an up-to-date stat on that. But it just goes to show, you think about even children, how we're giving antibiotics for viral infections. Like it's so, I have a 1-year-old and so I'm starting to research this a lot more, but I think becoming critical thinkers is so important that we can't just take this information as truth. We really have to question of is a viral infection going to be cured with a bacterial medicine?
Oh, I just heard somebody tell me I went to see the doctor and I wasn't even complaining about anything for my kids. And the doctor said, well, it's cold and flu season, so let me just prescribe these antibiotics in case something happens. And I was like, are you kidding me? In this stage and age, could somebody still be doing that? That's like malpractice.
Yeah, no, I know it's really hard not to get frustrated and passionate about it. And, the more research that you do and the more deeper you explore, I think the easier it is to get frustrated, and we have to learn a lot of patience in this stance. But also, again, that's where critical thinking comes in, where we have to wait, does this make sense? And it sounds like, I don't know if she gave it to her kids, but it sounded like that was something that kind of turned on a switch in her brain of is this an appropriate thing that I should be doing? So that's right. Good to hear.
Yeah, no, she didn't.
Good. Okay. So I know you've mentioned a little bit of your history with autoimmunity, but I'd love to touch into kind of this connection between gut health and autoimmunity, how that's happening, and what are some common concerns that show up?
Well, with autoimmunity, often people will have a sense that their body's inflamed. So they might feel, well, with Hashimoto's, let me just start there. Actually, Hashimoto's, you'll start to have hair loss, weight gain, coldness. You can lose the outer part of your eyebrows, fatigue. So if you have full blown, if you're hypothyroid at that point, those are sort of the symptoms. Now, if it's Hashimoto's that's preclinical, you might not have symptoms at all. And other autoimmunity, though, like we say, rheumatoid arthritis, you'll start to have aching in the joints, a sense of an inflamed body, with water retention and stiffness. It could be muscle aches, could be brain fog. It could manifest in, there's so many different autoimmune diseases literally attacking every possible organ system in the body and sometimes systemic. So it could be a whole variety of symptoms, but you can just sense that something is not right. And it often follows on gut health problems. So the connection there is that when you have a disrupted gut microbiome or you have dysbiosis, you will typically have an infection of some sort. You have an overgrowth of a bacteria that's not healthy, or of archaea, which are what cause constipation. That's similar to bacteria, but another single-celled organism that's a whole different kingdom. And when you have that dysbiosis, that creates a leaky gut or intestinal hyperpermeability. And then you have things slipping out of the intestinal tract. And those are typically either parts of cell walls of gram-negative bacteria, which is called lipopolysaccharide, and it's an endotoxin. It is toxic to us and creates inflammation. Or you have undigested or partially digested proteins, and gluten is, one of the common ones because it's a large, hard to digest protein. Same with casein from milk. And both of those, well, the gluten resembles your thyroid gland. And so the way that what happens is your body sees this undigested protein coming out and it starts to sort of attack it and clean it up. And then it sees your thyroid gland and it looks very similar. And so it starts to attack your thyroid. So that's, and actual gluten is, because it does for everybody, but, more so for people who are celiac or gluten sensitive, it does open up those tight junctions in the intestinal lining for some period of time. So it does allow out some of that protein. So it's one of the things that if you have an autoimmune disease, you should give up at least until you get that sorted and you've got, really reversed it like I have.
That makes sense. So the understanding, we know leaky gut, kind of a break in that mucosal lining. And so all these different organisms or proteins can seep out and go into areas that it shouldn't be. And so my mom has celiac disease and she is incredibly on top of it with no cross-contamination. I mean, won't even kiss her husband if they've eaten something. And that might sound bizarre to some people, but if you have celiac, any sort of cross-contamination could be extremely dangerous, especially if you get diagnosed later in life and maybe, you weren't working with a functional doctor who knew about this stuff ahead of time. What is the damage that has been leading up to this point? And so, I've heard that if you have one autoimmune issue, it's very easy to start kind of collecting other ones. And so that makes sense that maybe those junctions are opening up. I'm wondering if that's the way, if you have that autoimmune, I wonder if it's as simple as, the leaky gut is happening, things can move over different areas and make you more susceptible to other autoimmune issues. Do you know the science behind it, if that's what's happening?
Well, the current theory is that there's always three legs of the stool. There's a genetic predisposition to any given autoimmune disease. There's a leaky gut, and then there's an antigen, which is some sort of, be it toxin, undigested protein, inflammatory particle, et cetera, that is setting off the cascade. And that's really at the base of all autoimmunity.
Okay. Now, let's say you have a client who's coming and you listed out some of the symptoms of Hashimoto's and they're listening, okay, I have that. Where do they go from there? Is that just working with a practitioner? We start assessing different lab work and we go from there. What happens next?
Well, typically I'll see people who may either be hypothyroid, for example, but never diagnosed with Hashimoto's, or they have symptoms that make me wonder, they might be constipated, they might have some hair loss, some weight gain. So then I will suggest if they have only gotten a TSH, or if their TSH I already can see is a little bit elevated. So in typical reference ranges, you might see it go up to 4.5 or even 6, like 0.5 to 4.5, 0.3 to 4.5. But optimal is more in the sort of 0.5 to 2 range, at least according to most functional medicine people. So if you're seeing a 2.5, a 3, 3.5, then I'm starting to think they may have Hashimoto's going on, not yet be diagnosed. So then I say, go back to your doctor and see if you can get these antibodies. And if they can't, then I can send them a lab order through Ulta Labs, and they can order that and we can check. And then if they do, I say you should see an endocrinologist. You should get on thyroid medication. You don't want to leave that unaddressed. It's important to address thyroid issues. Otherwise, it can just get worse. And then you work on the functional side of it, which is healing the gut. There's systemic enzymes you can use to start eating up the antibodies. And then there's liver detoxification that's usually necessary. So there's a whole series of things that you then do.
You know, Lindsey, you mentioned something that I think is incredibly important. I just had this conversation with a neighbor the other day. You said optimal. And I think this is something that a lot of us don't look into. We go to our doctors and we do blood work. And I mean, it even happens with people like close in my family where they show, oh, I'm in range. What is the, I mean, we know the word in range and we know optimal, but I'd love to really explore this a little bit. When our doctors tell us in range versus optimal, why do we need to be looking at optimal, and really what's that difference?
Well, if you think about it, what is a reference range? It's the middle percentage. I'm not sure what the official is, but maybe it's 20 percentage points on either side of the mean that represent the population. A lot of these reference ranges, mind you, have been changing over the years. As we get less and less healthy, they just keep changing the reference range. So what used to be considered perhaps out of the reference range is now in the reference range because the vast majority of people aren't healthy. So the optimal levels are more like, I mean, if you think about it, like let's talk about, say, blood sugar. So there's a marker. Hemoglobin A1C is a 3-month marker of how glycated your hemoglobin is, which means how covered with sugar it is, basically. And 5.7 and above is pre-diabetic. So do you want to be 5.6? Because there you're just a snap away from pre-diabetic. And really, it's not like pre-diabetes officially starts at 5.7. It's just that the medical community decided that at 5.7, we're going to start treating people for this problem. So really, you want to be far, far west of that. So if you think about it, and there's consequences, right? So rates of Alzheimer's and dementia go up with each additional point on that scale. So do you want to have blood sugar dysregulation heading into your later years and have a not so functioning brain? Or do you want optimal blood flow to the brain and a well functioning brain well into your, late years?
Couldn't agree more. And maybe you're not fortunate enough and you're not working with a functional health doctor who's already, that is the baseline of what they're working from is optimal ranges. One, you can go in and ask them. When you're doing blood work or when you're doing your follow-up, they might say, oh, you're in range. Just ask them. Say, well, what's the optimal range I should be in? 2, there's so much information available now. I mean, you got to kind of siphon through some Google and whatnot. But generally speaking, for most of these different categories, whether it's blood sugar, whether it's thyroid levels, all these different things, you can Google what is the optimal range for this. And so go in with your homework to your doctor. I strung, I've been in the hospital since I was 2 for a variety of issues. And it wasn't until I turned to functional medicine where things really pivoted and my health like drastically improved. And so I just encourage you to look into functional wellness, integrative medicine, because they're naturally looking at the optimal. How do we take you from just surviving to thriving? And I think that's, an important thing to look at. Now, you've mentioned a few different strategies that we can utilize. You've mentioned some of these testings that we can do. But what other kinds of, I know this is broad spectrum. I mean, we could kind of niche down. We've talked about thyroid for a little bit. What are some lifestyle or nutrition or different strategies we can do on a daily basis to improve our gut health?
So obviously, nutrition is really important for gut health. I would say the biggest lack in the American diet, at least, is fiber. And you're not going to find any better powerhouses of fiber than beans and lentils. And they're not a huge part of most Americans' diet. So if you can start to try and get a half a cup of beans and lentils a day, you will definitely be feeding the beneficial gut bacteria that are going to promote good gut health and good stool quality, good motility, all that. Now, if you're already deep in throes of very bad constipation, that may actually be the recipe for disaster. You may find you can't tolerate those foods at all because those really feed the archaea that are constipating you. So that's a different issue. But if you're just like, sometimes I'm a little off, then that may be for you. And then, of course, fruits and vegetables and just eating, really 5 servings is a minimum a day of fruits and vegetables. Something like 9 servings is more towards the optimal, let's say.
Absolutely.
And then adequate protein. That's another issue that often people don't realize. Maybe they're on a vegan or a vegetarian diet and they're just not getting enough protein. There's no way around it. And you need that protein to do all the things your body does, from creating digestive enzymes to creating the lining of the intestines. So if you're not getting enough of that, then that can be an issue. And then also keeping your stress level down, because or managing stress, because if you start to get stressed out, that can start this cascade where you have elevated cortisol that elevates your blood sugar. When your blood sugar is elevated, that can then contribute towards breakdown of your secretory IgA, which is your gut immune defense system. Then all of a sudden the gut bacteria that's in there, but it's not overgrown, can start to overgrow. So then you get elevations, say, in things like Staphylococcus or Streptococcus or Klebsiella, Citrobacter, E. coli. These things, they're in there often, but they're not necessarily causing problems as long as your gut immune defenses are up. As soon as they go down, then that stuff can start to take over. Then you start seeing alterations in motility, in stool quality, bloating, these kinds of things. Or you can have a yeast overgrowth if you've got elevated cortisol and blood sugar, because every time your cortisol elevates, that elevates your blood sugar. So, regular stress management practices incorporated into your day, like obviously exercise, yoga, meditation, breath work, walking, listening to music, dancing, laughing, spending quality time with your loved ones, like all those things that bring the cortisol down. It can't just be go, serve everyone else's needs nonstop.
I love that. I think you provided a little bit of information for all different types of individuals. And it's crazy how much, your mental health and your nervous system is so connected to gut health, because you can eat the most biodynamic, organic, high quality foods. But if you were living in a very hyper stimulated environment, your gut health can be completely out of whack. And so it's funny, it's years ago, I'm thinking I'm doing all this good with intermittent fasting and keto and high intensity workouts at 5 a.m. And it was wreaking havoc on my body because I was in a very heavy season of life. And so what my body needed at that time was rest and nourishment and calories and carbs. And obviously making sure that we're eating real quality foods. And it wasn't just, a laziness and a lethargic, but it was really listening to my body and giving my body the nourishment it needs. And so that's why I believe in, there's seasons to life. There's different seasons where we can have different things and we have different energies, and really understanding what's going on with our body. I love that you talked to, the beans and the fiber. I'm such a believer in fiber and diversity of foods, but I think right away, because I'm right now in this gut healing journey, 5 years ago, I was diagnosed with SIBO, H. pylori, C. diff, Blastocystis hominis candida, found out I had Lyme disease and PCOS and all these fun things. Wow. And so, I've done low FODMAP and all that kind of stuff. But now stuff is back. I haven't done the deeper testing to figure out what's really going on. But I'm thinking of beans and I'm like, okay, we got to start slowly integrating it. So I'm glad that you mentioned that is going to be great for some individuals, but maybe it's the individuals who extreme bloating. I feel like constipation can go 2 ways. It could be you really need the fiber or you need to kind of pause. So would you say that without really working one-on-one with somebody, I wonder if there's constipation without bloating. Is that a normal thing?
That exists, sure. Yeah. But as you get more and more backed up, then you start to see the bloating because there's nowhere for the stuff to go.
True.
You have gas that's basically trapped. And then you may see, burping too, because it's got to come out somewhere. So, but you rightly bring up, fiber doesn't turn out to be perfect for everybody, especially people with inflammatory bowel disease who are flaring. So if you have unexplained diarrhea and there's no bloating, for example, or unexplained constipation and no bloating, it's possible you could have Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis, in which case the absolute worst thing for you while you're flaring is fiber. And you want to do the opposite, which is take out all the fiber, anything that could be irritating your gut, and heal it up and then slowly reintroduce it.
Yeah. No, and I'm wondering if that's things, like bone broth or glutamine, some other types of supplements that are going to be more healing and nourishing than fiber necessarily would. And I'm guessing it's like healing that leaky gut if that's the individual. So
usually if you're dealing with inflammatory bowel disease, it's the combination of a diet that's fiber-free. Yeah, you can use supplements to heal leaky gut, but often there's a dysbiosis there too. So often, in particular, like with Crohn's disease, it's been studied that the plaques that cause the ulcerations in the intestines in Crohn's disease are caused by biofilms containing a combination of Candida and 2 other bacteria, one of which is H. pylori, that are causing that breakdown of the lining. And so, there's certain probiotics that have been studied that break down those biofilms. So it's kind of individual. Then there's other potential treatments. One is a prescription drug called low-dose naltrexone that's particularly helpful in inflammatory bowel disease. So it's really all of the pillars, and addressing stress, making sure you're getting enough sleep. All the pillars of health apply in every condition, including the gut health conditions.
Absolutely. And if you're on a journey with gut health and you've tried all these different things, this might be an indicator to start looking deeper, start doing some testing to really narrow down what is the root cause. And I think that's fundamentally what functional health is figuring out the root cause of what's going on, because we don't want to be putting a Band-Aid on this stuff. We want to, I think there's the analogy of if you have some pain on your foot and you take your shoe off and there's all these rocks, well, yeah, you can take Advil to help with the pain, but why don't we pull the rocks out? And so that's ultimately what we're trying to do. Well, Lindsey, where can people find more information about you? I know you have your podcast. I'd love to be able to share this insight with listeners. Again, she has a wealth of information. I think there's going to be something for everybody.
Yeah. So obviously my podcast, The Perfect Stool, you can find it on any podcast player. My website is highdeserthealthcoaching.com, since I'm in the high desert here in Tucson, Arizona. But although I see people nationwide and outside the country, I've got a number of people internationally. And then I also have a website, perfectstool.com, where I sell a couple select gut health supplements.
Well, thank you so much for being here. I think we pulled a lot out, and people have hopefully a little bit more direction if they are facing some of these gut health issues of what's the next steps that they can do, and that there is stuff available for you no matter how, where you are in the spectrum. Ultimately, how do we get to that optimal health? I think that's our goal. So thank you so much, Lindsey. I appreciate your time.
You're welcome. Thanks so much for having me.